The Hemi, you know it, you love it, but how much do you know about it? What makes an engine a Hemi, the history of the Hemi, Chrysler's history with the Hemi, and other automakers that use the Hemi, not just Chrysler. Today we're talking all things Hemi.
This thing's a Hemi.
The term Hemi instantly brings to mind images of muscle cars, both old and new, from Chrysler to Plymouth to Dodge, and many cars in between. But did you know that Chrysler was neither the inventor of the Hemi nor the only automaker to use it? Before we get into the history of the Hemi and who's used it besides Chrysler and Chrysler also, let's talk about what makes Hemi a Hemi. A Hemi is called a Hemi because of the dome shape of each combustion chamber in each cylinder versus the typical more flat top cylindrical shape. But why would you do that? Well, for one, you can make higher compression ratios out of the same size cylinders. And not only that, you get better air and exhaust flow, which both lead to more power. But the Hemi isn't all perfect. Not only is it more expensive, the drivetrains are more complex, so there's more R&D required and more money required. But if you're willing to put in the time and the effort as an automaker, you can make more power and have better air and exhaust flow, which is better for the engine. So who created the Hemi engine design and who's used it besides Chrysler? The Hemi engine design was created by two brothers named Alfred and Victor Goldschmidt of the Belgian Pipe Company. They were the inventors of the original Hemi engine. They designed it and used it in their premier race car, and it was used in 1905, and that was the only year it got used because the Hemi engine was too heavy in their car, and it put the car over the limit for weight, and it wasn't used successfully again until Fiat used it in 1907, and then it wasn't used again until Peugeot used it in 1912 and Alfa Romeo used it in 1914, both for racing. What about non-race car uses? Some other brands besides Chrysler have used the Hemi-style engine inside of their own production street vehicles for the public use, including the early versions of the famous 2.5-liter version of the Busso V6 from Alfa Romeo, to Aston Martin in their V8s from the late 60s to the late 80s. Ford, which will be ironic as we talk about Chrysler's Hemis, used it in normal cars in the 80s in 4 and 6 cylinders. Jaguar used it in race cars and street cars alike, including their famous E-Type and their D-Type race car between 1948 and 1975. Lamborghini's V12 was originally designed as a Hemi in 1963 until the Aventador. Porsche used Hemi combustion chambers in their air-cooled flat sixes from 1963 to 1999 in their 911s, and Toyota used it for their V8 Century, but also in the famous, beautiful 2000 GT. But cars weren't the only use for Hemis. Back in the 40s during World War II, they actually had a design for the P-47 Republic Thunderbolt fighter plane that actually used a Hemi. We'll get to that too. It didn't actually make it into war, but it was tested and used in the P-47. But it was used in war in the M47 Patton tank, one of the most famous tanks in the world. So that's a little bit of the history of the non-Chrysler Hemi. But Chrysler is what made Hemi a household name. So let's get into Chrysler's history. So now let's talk about Chrysler and their history with the Hemi. And of course, I had to do it while being in my own Chrysler Hemi, of course. So pretty much every enthusiast knows the term Hemi because of Chrysler and their brands, especially in the 60s, like Dodge, Plymouth, etc. So people know Chrysler and know Hemi because of Chrysler cars, right? But did you know that Chrysler didn't even start with cars? They actually were the ones who developed the test engine for the P-47 that we mentioned. And not only did they develop the P-47 engine, it actually had a supercharger. Unfortunately, like I said, it didn't make it in time out of testing to actually be used. So not only did they work on that wartime Hemi, they also worked on the Hemi that we mentioned was in the Patton tank. So they actually started out working on a supercharged fighter plane engine and a tank engine, and that's how they got into the Hemi game. Chrysler didn't even start making Hemis for cars until 1950 for the 1951 model year, which was actually named the Firepower. That was the name of the engine. It was the Firepower. And it originally came in a 331 cubic inch or 5.7 liter, 5.4 liter configuration named the 331, of course. and that engine was good for 180 horsepower. Then they actually developed them for race car use, including Briggs Cunningham for racing and Carl Kiekhaefer, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, for NASCAR. And they use them for racing. And then they actually came out with a larger version for the Chrysler C300 that got 300 horsepower in the 1950s. Then in 1956, the 354 firepower was released, making between 340 and 355 horsepower. The largest version of the firepower was was the 392, coincidentally, you know, the ancestor to the engine in my Scat Pack, which is also a 392. And that was the largest version of the firepower, and that made 390 horsepower back in the 1950s. This car makes 485, and this car was put out 60 years later. So Dodge also got the Hemi.
The power of success, surging new breakaway power in the greatest Dodge engine ever created. The new 230 horsepower Red Ram V8.
And it was marketed under the name Power Dome, which firepower, Power Dome, very 1950s and 60s engine names. I think I like Power Dome better. But theirs range anywhere from 241 cubic inches in 1953 to 325 in 1957. So back then, Dodge, unlike nowadays, didn't get any of the big boys. Then Chrysler abandoned the Hemi design in 1959 to 1964 for their wedge head B design engine. We could get into that, but that's not really what this video is about. But then the Hemi returned gloriously in 1964.
Charger, new leader of the Dodge Rebellion. Muscle enough to catch anything on the road. Available with 4 barrels, dual exhaust, V8 power.
Which was revived for NASCAR in the 426 cubic inch or 7-liter configuration.
You actually think you can match that little slant 6 of yours against his 426 Hemi?
The ancestor to the modern Hellcat. That was created for NASCAR, and unfortunately it only got to race for 1 year for 2 reasons. One, it wasn't homologated, aka it wasn't available to the public, and then also, of course, Ford complained. That's why it was ironic that Ford made a Hemi in the 80s, but they got their ass whooped from all the power, and they weren't happy, so they made a complaint to NASCAR. So due to this, Chrysler said screw it, and they homologated the 426 in the exact amount that they needed for NASCAR. So no more, just the exact amount, just so they could use it in NASCAR and stick it to NASCAR and Ford. And it was named the Street Hemi. Nothing too creative, but probably better than Firepower or Power Dome. And it made 425 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque, even though it was dynoed at 435 and 472 foot-pounds. So they overrated the foot-pounds, underrated the horsepower. But still, back in the 60s, that's insane because this car, which is a 2018, makes 485 and 465 respectively. So that was a lot of power, and that was their street Hemi. We saw the 426 make it into some famous 60s muscle cars like the Charger and the Challenger, the Barracuda, the Super Bee, the Roadrunner.
So later on today, I'm picking up my Hemi Roadrunner. That's right, I said Hemi.
The Daytona and the Superbird. So iconic 60s muscle cars got that 426. Then in 1971, the V8 went away due to tightening environmental registration. In 1971, the V8 Hemi actually disappeared, and the V8 part of it is key. But the V8 Hemi disappeared due to tightening environmental regulations, and then of course the looming gas crisis of the 1970s. But the Hemi did not die from Chrysler completely. The Hemi actually lived on in the form of in an inline 6-cylinder in the Valiant Charger in Australia. But that only was 215 cubic inches all the way up to 265 cubic inches and made between 206 and made up to 206 horsepower, and then it died in 1981, which was the death of the Hemi for 2 decades. Then finally, in 2003, the Hemi made a glorious return.
The all-new Dodge Ram Heavy Duty.
Did you mean the Charger? Because you know that's got a Hemi too.
Now with a 345 horsepower, 5.7-liter Hemi Magnum.
Back in its V8 form, but it was no longer marketed in cubic inches because that had gone out of style in general. Now it was marketed in liters like we see today, which I could go through all the liters, but we'll run through that as we run through the modern history of Chrysler. The first modern Hemi was the 5.7 liter, which is still used, was still used up until the EV, which we'll get to. But they put it in anything Chrysler and Dodge could fit it in. So you name it, the Durango, the Charger, the Challenger, the 300, the Cherokee, the Durango, the Aspen. The Chrysler Aspen is a forgotten vehicle that even I forget about, but it was Chrysler's Durango. But it made anywhere from 300 to 345 horsepower, depending on the application. And then 6 years later, it was revised. We got 360 to 395 horsepower out of the 5.7. And in 2005, we were introduced to the 6.1 liter used in the SRT8 models for the Charger, the Challenger, the Cherokee, the 300C, and the Magnum RIP. But they all got SRT8 trims. And so then we had the 5.7 and the 6.1. But in 2011, we were introduced to the 6.4 liter motor, the 392. Similar, but not quite the one that's in this car. But that was originally displayed in 2005, and when it was displayed in the auto shows, it made 525 horsepower. But the production version was released in 2011 at 470 horsepower, and that became the new SRT8 engine. So everything that had the 6.1 SRT8 then moved on to the 6.4. But in 2015, the 6.4 liter was bumped up to 485 horsepower in its most modern version, which is what powers the Scat Pack that I'm currently driving. And that got into everything it could. Unfortunately, the Magnum was no longer. So we've seen it in the Durango, we've seen it in the Charger, the Challenger, the Grand Cherokee, and even eventually the Wrangler got a 392, which is just an insane thing when you think about it. Finally, in 2015, we got arguably the greatest, most ultimate version of the Hemi, and that was the 6.2 liter supercharged Hellcat motor. Now, we all know about this Hellcat motor. It's been marketed to death. We've all heard about it, but we also all know that it makes 707 horsepower due to not only its 6.2 liters of displacement, but also its 2.4 liter supercharger. The first car I ever drove was a Focus that had a 2-liter 4-cylinder. So it's 0.4 liters bigger than the first car's engine that I ever drove. And so, of course, we know that made 707 horsepower, and Fiat Chrysler, it was then Fiat Chrysler, stuffed it into everything that they could. They made Hellcat versions of everything that they could. You know, we had the Trackhawk, the Durango, Charger, Challenger, all of that. And then in 2018, they decided to bump that supercharger up to 2.7 liters, and we got the famous Demon engine, which, if you don't know, the Challenger Demon, unfortunately, we never got a Charger Demon, makes 808 horsepower on pump gas. They love the first and last digit being the same number, and up to 840 on 100 octane race fuel. So then finally, also in 2018, we got the Elephant released. Unfortunately, the 426 cubic inch 7-liter modern 426 Hemi was only released as a crate motor. You could get it in an NA configuration, which had 590 horsepower, or you could get it in a supercharged version that made 1,000 horsepower. It was an insane crate motor that I think is really a shame that it never made it into production vehicles. Then the next version of the Hemi we got in 2019, the Hellcat engine got an injection of steroids, and that 6.2 liter engine with still its 2.4 liter supercharger was now making 797 horsepower in the Red Eye Challenger. That was 2019. We didn't get the Red Eye Charger, unfortunately, until 2021, which is my dream Charger to own, really. But so in 2021, we then got the Red Eye Charger. But that's not all we have for Hemis. We got our last version of the modern Hemi in 2023. But now it's not the Hellcat. It's not the getting a steroid injection. It's the Demon getting a steroid injection. And why, you might ask, Dodge? Fuck you. That's why. It's probably what Dodge would tell you. But the Demon was insane, and then they made it even more insane, where they bumped it up to the Demon 170, which is making 900 horsepower on pump gas and 1,025 horsepower on E85. Then, unfortunately, as we now know, the Hemi died. The Hemi died because Stellantis became the company. Fiat Chrysler merged with a few European brands, became Stellantis, and that was the end of the Hemi as we knew it. They moved on to the EV Charger.
Ain't gonna be no Hemi.
Which, unfortunately, is not selling well, because who would have guessed the main buyers of Chargers and Challengers want the Hemi V8. They don't want an EV. I actually really don't mind the EV Charger. I think it looks good. But for $70,000, you aren't going to get me in one, and you're certainly not going to get all the EV hating, V8 loving Charger and Challenger owners that love Hemis to get into it. So unfortunately, that was the death of the Hemi. Now, it seems like the Hemi is headed for a resurrection. We have the EV Charger failing, mostly because of its price and because it alienated its main fan base, right? People who love old school muscle cars in a modern version, which is what the Charger and the Challenger really represented. But the good news is it looks like we're getting a gas Charger. There has been leaks recently of the inline-6 Hurricane engine being tested in the Charger and filmed for a commercial. And yes, that's not a Hemi. But according to media outlet sources, Car and Driver, Road and Track, Jalopnik, and other car media outlets, we are getting the Hemi back. It looks like, according to Car and Driver sources, that we are going to have the production of the Hemi start this month, August 2025, and we should be seeing the 5.7 liter, the 6.4 liter, and of course the 6.2 liter supercharged Hellcat engine. So luckily the Hemi is not fully dead. We will be getting it back. So we will be seeing a new Scat Pack, and they're obviously already working on the platform for the gas engine to fit into the EV Charger because we're seeing it now. Unfortunately, the Challenger is dead, and we have a 2-door Charger and a 4-door Charger, and I would love to see that change. But the word is we are going to get the Hemi and everything they can fit in again. SUVs, the Ram. The Ram will probably be the first thing we see with a Hemi, but we are getting the Hemis back because, as Stellantis had to learn the hard way, you just can't kill the Hemi. The Hemi has tried to die many times. It tried to die after the 50s. It was brought back in the 60s. It tried to die in the 60s. It stayed a little bit alive in the 70s in an inline-6 form. Then it tried to die then. It tried to die because of fuel and environmental regulations, and it wouldn't die then. And so then it came back in the 2000s and stayed alive through the 2010s and into the early 2020s. And it looks like by the mid to late 2020s, we'll be getting the Hemi back again. So that's the history of the Hemi, from tanks to airplanes to race cars to street cars to drag cars, from Alfa Romeo to Jaguar to Toyota to Dodge to Chrysler to Plymouth. That is the history of the Hemi. They tried to kill the Hemi multiple times. They tried to kill it after the 50s. They tried to kill it after the 60s. They tried to kill it after the 70s. They tried to keep it alive in the 80s. Then they tried to kill it. Then it came back in the 2000s, and we had in the 2000s, 2010s, early 2020s, and they just learned from 100-something horsepower street cars to 1,025 horsepower street legal drag cars. You just can't kill the Hemi. Then they try to kill it with EVs, and what do you know? It looks like the Hemi is returning. So that's the history of the Hemi. Let me know in the comments down below what you learned, if I got anything wrong, what your opinion on the Hemi is. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you like this type of content. We'll be making other videos on automotive history, especially related to the cars I have, any updates to any cars I own, get rid of, etc. So make sure to hit that notification bell if you like that type of content and you want to see it first. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.